Alright, so let's go through sort of the answers to the quiz from last weekend, or at least some suggested answers. Obviously, there are lots of answers that are possible to these questions, so please, check your individual exams. I've put comments on them so that you can see if you missed points, why you missed points, and you can go through there. So again, these are our suggested answers. They are not the be-all, end-all, only correct answers. Okay, so just look at yours and email or call me if you have any questions. Okay, so the first one is to ask you guys a question. Suppose the price of capital in the restaurant industry decreases. Explain how, holding everything else constant, the decrease in the price of capital affects the demand for labor in the restaurant industry. Okay, so this one's saying, the price of capital, which we abbreviate with C, decreases. Right? So what happens? Okay, well, so one obvious thing that we're pretty confident about is if the price of capital decreases, we want to see, or we would expect to see, the restaurant buy more capital. Okay, and from here, right, because if the price is lower, we should expect the quantity demanded to increase, right, just like we always do. Okay, not the demand, which some people are still mixing up. Some people are still saying when the price falls, demand increases, and that's not true. Okay, you got to go read through the chapter 1 notes again if you're saying that, because I will continue to take points off for that because it's wrong. Okay, so if the price goes down, people are going to buy more, right? The restaurant's going to buy more capital. And then we have two sort of offsetting effects. So one effect is that, at least two offsetting effects on labor. So we're going to see, we're obviously going to see more capital being purchased. And on the one hand, this means that in order to make the same amount of food, the restaurant will need less labor. Right? And so on the one hand, it's very obvious it will decrease, right? Decrease labor demand due to what we could call a substitution effect. Okay, so I need less labor to produce the same amount of output, and so I will buy less labor. Okay, but on the other hand, if labor and capital are complementary, then the purchase of more capital will actually lead to an increase in the demand for labor in order to use that capital, right? Because again, what good is capital if there's not labor there to purchase it? Okay, so another offsetting effect would be an increase in labor demand. Right, and we can see that. So let's think about what's going to happen. So if the price of capital decreases, the cost of producing food or additional food for the restaurant will decrease. This will lower the price of food in the restaurant at least a little bit. The lower price of food in the restaurant will result in customers buying more food, and with more food being bought, we're going to see an increased demand for labor to bring the food to people. And so the actual effect on labor demand is ambiguous, right? We don't know if it's going to increase or decrease, but we do know it'll decrease because of the substitution effect, which a lot of you pointed to, and it will increase due to the complementarity of labor and capital, which a few of you pointed to. So I gave full credit for either answer, and one person got extra credit, 1 point of extra credit for saying both answers. Okay, so the answer to number 1 is the effect is actually ambiguous. Okay, so for number 2 actually just came straight out of the notes. If you read the notes, you saw the answer. You basically could have copy and pasted the paragraph there and gotten 100%. So I was a little bit surprised when people, missed this one. Okay, so this one's talking about the marginal physical product and the marginal value product, okay, of orange pickers. And it says, so if, let's say, the new technology quadruples the amount of oranges that an orange picker can pick in a single hour, under what conditions will labor demand for orange market increase, right? So under what conditions will the demand for labor for orange pickers increase? So it'll increase if, demand for oranges is elastic, right? And the reason being, so let's think about what we've just described here. So we've just described a situation where in the market for oranges, right, we've just described a situation where the supply curve has actually shifted to the right. There's new technology which shifts supply to the right. It increases productivity. Okay, so now the price of oranges is lower. Okay, and so if the price of oranges falls by just a little bit and the quantity increases by fourfold or more, by quite a bit, right, the marginal value product will increase, which will in turn increase the demand for labor, right, just straight out of the notes. And labor demand will decrease if demand for oranges is inelastic, right? Because if the demand for oranges is inelastic, an increase in supply will result in a massive decrease in price, and that decrease in price would be big enough to actually reduce the marginal value product, even though the marginal physical product had increased. Okay, so this was straight out of the notes. A lot of people wrote something about the demand for oranges increasing. There's nothing in the question that says anything about demand for oranges increasing. Okay, so nothing in the question says that that happens. So it's wise to assume that it doesn't happen. Okay, so unless the question said, so the question gives you all the information you need to solve the problem. So don't import new assumptions. Okay, so number three was a bit tricky. I wanted to see just kind of your intuition on these things. Okay, so consider two workers, David and Lewis, who are identical in every way. They both earn the same wage rate, and neither has any form of non-labor income. So both of us only earn money by working. We don't earn money any other way. Okay. The only difference between them is that Dave chooses to work 40 hours, while Lewis chooses to work only 10 hours. Due to improving economic conditions, both Dave and Lewis get a 10% raise. Okay? Explain which worker is most likely to have a larger income effect as a result of the wage increase, and which person will be most likely to increase the amount of hours that they work. Okay, so if we're both exactly the same, what we have is Dave working 40 hours and Lewis working 10 hours. Okay, so a lot of you guys assumed a wage rate, which is great, right? So let's assume the wage rate that was most common, which was $10 per hour. Right, that means Dave makes $400 per week, and Lewis makes only $100 per week. And with a 10% raise, now they're making $11 per hour. Right, so Dave would make $440 per week, and Lewis would make $110 per week. Right, and so we can see that Dave's income has increased the most because he's working the most number of hours, and Lewis's income has only increased by $10. And so the intuitive thing would be that Dave's income effect would be larger because the effect of this 10% raise on his income is 4 times greater. Okay. As for which person would be most likely to increase the amount of hours they work, there you can say either one. I just wanted to see your justification. So we could say that Dave would be most likely to increase his hours of work because he clearly values income very highly, right? So his indifference curves for income and leisure, Dave's indifference curves would look like this. It would be really relatively flat, right? And Lewis's, if I use red for Lewis, right? Lewis's would be sort of steep, right? And so we could say that Dave's more likely to increase the number of hours he works because his substitution effect is probably going to be greater, right? We could also say that Lewis is, right? Lewis, at a low number of dollars, he might respond more to the substitution effect than Dave does, right? So really, I wanted to see your justification for picking one and then going with it. Okay, so and just make sure that you can reason through, you can provide a reasonable defense of why either David or Lewis would choose to work more hours. Okay. Some people did this in like a yearly thing, so if that's true, just multiply these numbers by 52 for 52 weeks, and you've got the same idea. Okay, so this one was just testing whether or not you could defend your answer. Okay. Number 4 was relatively straightforward. The only part that was difficult was evidently part C. Okay, so for part A, the current wage bill, right, per week was $2,000, right, which we get by multiplying 50 hours times 2 workers times 20, right, and that'll get you $2,000. Okay, so everyone got that part right, so that's A. Right, B. Okay, now we've got 40 hours times 2 workers times 20 plus 20 hours times 2 workers times 1.5 times 20, which is going to be equal to 2,200, right? So part B, the total wage bill with overtime with the Fair Labor Standards Act in place, right? Over 40 hours gets time and a half. That brings the total wage bill to 2,200. And part C, right? Suppose that if the firm could find someone, they could keep these people, the two original workers at 40 hours, so no more overtime, and they'd hire, a third worker for the remaining 20 hours. Okay, so if they can do that, what they're basically doing is reducing, this part here, right, down by getting rid of this. Okay, so this would be like these 2 workers would be here, and then I'm sorry, this should be just 10, all right, 10 hours, not 20. Okay, and then they'd say, they'd hire basically 2 workers at 40, right, and 1 worker for 20 hours for $20 per hour, $20 per hour, right? And they get back to a wage bill of $2,000. So then the question becomes, how much would you be willing to spend to save $200? And the answer is, $200. All right, you would be willing to spend up to $200 and not a penny more in order to find a way to save $200. Okay, and you can multiply these by 52 to get the annual figures, which some people did, which is totally fine. Okay, but the point here is that they're willing to spend up to and including the number of dollars that they would be saving, right, in order to save the money, right? So they would spend up to $200. Okay, and then the last one, the extra credit one, a few of you tried it, which was cool. But most people that tried it literally just told me what a monopsony was. And you told me the basic things that I put in the notes for you. So you didn't get any credit for that, for just repeating things that I said. This was an opportunity to try to get you to think more critically about this monopsony model. Okay, so the monopsony model, again, says that if firms have an upward sloping labor supply curve, then their marginal expenditure curve is up here, and they'll demand, or they'll purchase this much labor and pay them that much. All right, and the thought is that if I increase the minimum wage, right? So if I raise the minimum wage, I can increase employment, which is true, right? So if we increase the minimum wage, right, to exactly here, right, the marginal expenditure curve would look like that. It'd be that the red part, okay? And so that would be the marginal expenditure curve. Firms would employ more people, right? And everything would be great. And the reason why is because the marginal expense of labor would be exactly equal to the wage up until this point, because we can't pay them less, right? And so that's one theory. Bob Murphy has a great critique where he basically says, there can't exist a monopsony in low-skilled labor because low-skilled labor is what he calls fungible, meaning that low-skilled labor can be used basically anywhere. So the idea that there's only one single purchaser of low-skilled labor is somewhat absurd. Okay. Now there might be, depending on how you frame the issue, the NFL might be a monopsony, right? Because they're the only buyers of professional football in the United States, right? And so that's kind of true. They're kind of monopsonistic. But their workers aren't making minimum wage. In fact, they're making millions of dollars per year. So a minimum wage not going to affect their salaries. Okay. So how can we explain this? And so the hint I gave you is that the y-axis here is the price per unit. Okay. And so what we're getting at here is this idea that every single person has to be paid exactly the same. Right? Every person in the business has to be paid exactly the same. And it turns out that most businesses don't really do that, right? They don't do that because they don't really have to, right? And the reason why they don't have to is in part because we don't know how much our colleagues are making, right? So in America, the culture is evidently, don't speak about salaries. In Europe, it's not that way, by the way. Europeans talk about their salary all the time. Which as an American I find strange, but different cultures. But the point here is that we can pay different workers different wages, and we can also pay different workers different wages based on the fact that the different workers have different productivities, right? So here it's assuming that every worker is exactly identical. That might not be the case, and if it's not the case, then we won't be paying them the same wage, right? But the basic idea here is that just because, so if you've ever worked for an industry, for a company that hired another person, right? If you've ever done that, and if the conditions are true, so if the conditions of an upward sloping labor supply curve for individual firms, if those are true, right, which is just like it's annoying to find a new job, that generates an upward sloping supply curve. If that's true, then anytime, any place you've ever worked before that hired a new person should have also given you a raise. Why didn't they do it? It's like, well, it turns out companies don't have to give raises to current workers when they hire a new worker, right? Contracts exist. And so the trick here is that not every worker wage or salary is negotiated at the same time, right? Or other critiques are not all workers are identical, right? And so basically the point here is that when a business hires a new person, they don't actually have to give raises to everyone else. They've already got contracts signed with them. Okay, so the trick is basically contracts exist. Okay, so that was the exam. Please feel free to email, call, text, whatever. Get in touch with me if you have any questions, and we can go from there.